Okay, camera, do not give up on me now, please. Hello and welcome to the Looking Glass World. My name is Aradhna Matthews, and this week we are going into one of my favorite non-fiction books. Welcome to part one of a wonderful book called Humankind. If you don't really care about non-fiction, I'd say just this one book is all you need to read. It really changed the way that I see the world. But if you don't have time to read the book or you find it too information heavy, that's what I'm here for. I have my notes here as usual. Last week we looked at a book called Sapiens, where the author talked us through how Homo sapiens went from being basically the same as every other ape on the planet to literally ruling the world. And character traits have developed with this extremely rapid rise to the top. Selfishness, insecurity, and violence, intolerance. It seems to have created this darkness inside every human being. News and everything that's obsessing about this darkness, and it really makes it seem like the world is getting worse and worse every day. With all of this surrounding us, it came as such a breath of fresh air to come across this book where he argues that in spite of all that I've just said, at our heart, humans are good. That's not to say that there isn't darkness, but what Bregman is claiming is that the darkness is not the reason that humankind has flourished in the way we have today. What has allowed us to achieve everything we've achieved is our goodness. I'm going to start you off on some of these super famous experiments, pieces of work supposed to prove the fundamental darkness in humanity, but are all wrong. Ready? Let's go. So in the 1970s, a professor in Stanford named Philip Zimbardo was looking at rising brutality in American prisons, and he wanted to get to the bottom of why this was happening. And he was wondering which of two possible scenarios was true. One, that the guards themselves were sadists, like the system was hiring sadistic guards, or that the system was turning people into sadists. If this were true, good and bad and all of that is irrelevant. It doesn't matter how nice you are. If you get a job as a prison guard, even the nicest person is going to conform to that role and thereby become a sadist. He decided to test this out and see which of the two was true. He did this by taking a random basement in the Stanford campus and turning it into a makeshift prison. He then got a bunch of volunteers who did not know each other previously and randomly assigned them into two groups. Group one were the guards and group two were the prisoners. The prisoners were then arrested. They were blindfolded, taken to this prison, processed like your usual prisoners, given a uniform. They were no longer addressed by their names. They were given an ID number, and that's how they would be addressed moving forward, and they were chained up and imprisoned. The second group were the guards. They were also given a uniform plus like a whistle and a couple of other things that guards typically have, and they were told to do whatever was necessary to maintain order and to make sure the prisoners are listening to you and respecting you. My dogs. After setting all of this up, Zimbardo then stepped back. He didn't interfere. He just sat and watched and wanted to see how events would unfold. Zimbardo was very surprised to find out how quickly things descended into the darkness. There was a drastic shift in the behavior of the prisoners and the guards. The guards were coming in and doing things like waking prisoners up at 2:30 in the morning, depriving them of sleep. They were giving them solitary confinement for punishment. They were denying them food as punishment. They were being very brutal to them and treating them as if they weren't human beings. Meanwhile, the prisoners now had to rely on the guards for everything, for food, for simple basic needs, and they started to become more and more submissive, caving and bending to whatever these guards were doing to them, and even telling on each other and ratting each other out to get favor from the guards. But what was the most disturbing was that within the first 36 hours, one volunteer seemed to have a total mental breakdown. Prisoner 8612. He started showing acute emotional disturbance, disorganized thinking, uncontrollable crying, and rage. and had to be removed from the experiment. What ended up happening was an experiment that was designed to last for 2 weeks had to be stopped within 1 week because it was just getting crazy. And it proved to Zimbardo that people inherently will conform to the roles that they are given. Everyone was amazed by Zimbardo's discovery, and he got himself a place in the American Psychology Association. For decades later, people were talking about this experiment. He even published a book in 2007 called The Lucifer Effect, understanding how good people turn evil, and Zimbardo himself lived happily ever after. However, Rutger Bregman reveals how this world-famous Stanford Prison Experiment that was the reason Zimbardo's career skyrocketed to the top was faked. Here's what really happened. Number one, Zimbardo claimed that he did not tell the guards what to do. He just said, do whatever was necessary to maintain order. Not true. There is documented evidence of Zimbardo talking to the guards before the experiment began, telling them things like, we can create a sense of frustration, we can create fear in them, we're going to take away their individuality in various ways. They're going to be wearing uniforms, and at no time will anybody call them by name. They will have numbers and be called only by their numbers. In general, what all this should create in them is a sense of powerlessness. He told them what to do. He briefed them to the point of what feeling they should inspire in the prisoners. So he went and said, I want you to make them afraid. I want you to make them feel powerless. And then goes and publishes his work saying, I didn't tell them to do anything, and look, they made the prisoners feel powerless and afraid. Who could have seen this coming? After I read this, I was shocked. Point number two, Zimbardo changed the premise of the experiment after the fact. It started off as a study of prisoners, not about the guards. Knowing this, it makes sense that he would have briefed the guards because they were not part of this experiment. But what does not make sense is he has seen something happening, and it makes a better story to say the environment turns them into sadists. So I'm going to change the entire definition. A better story emerged at the end, and he appropriated it onto a completely different experiment. Number three, he claimed that these volunteers were selected totally at random. He specifically recruited a certain volunteer to be a guard. That person had already done a sort of DIY version of this experiment in a dorm room, and this person already had sadistic traits. He worked with Zimbardo to create all of these like tortures and torments for the prisoners, and he doctored the whole thing. So what did Zimbardo do? He plants a sadist to prove that people are sadists. As my father would say, totally warped. But the cherry on top is prisoner 8612, who had the mental breakdown, whose footage was shown all over the world as proof. He faked it. Why did he fake it? He wanted to study for his exams or some tests or whatever, and he was told yes, he could study while the experiment was going on. But then he started this experiment and they took away his books and put him in the role of a prisoner. He said, I want to study. They said, you're not allowed to study. He said, then I want to leave the experiment. And then Zimbardo apparently told him, no, you can't leave the experiment. Only people who are showing signs of clear psychological distress can leave this experiment. So what did he do? He didn't have much of a choice, honestly. He had a psychotic breakdown, put on the performance of a lifetime, quite literally, and that became used as documented proof that this is inherent behavior to all human beings. How do we know he faked it? He told reporters. It didn't fit with the story, so they ignored it. Now, what of Zimbardo? Zimbardo was interviewed and he said in 2018, so quite recently, for an experiment in the 70s, people can say whatever they want about it. It's the most famous study in the history of psychology at this point. There's no study that people talk about 50 years later. I'm not going to defend it anymore. The defense is its longevity. I'm not going to defend this from a scientific perspective. I'm just going to say people talk about it, so it's true. And here's where it gets interesting, because the BBC did not know about any of this at the time. They decided, hey, let's turn this into a super profitable reality TV show. Of course, everyone was like, how can you be so insensitive? This is horrible, but they all tuned in to watch. They did exactly the same thing as Zimbardo claimed. It was the world's most boring show. Nothing happened. The guards sat around all day, did the chores, took care of the prisoners, gave them food. Prisoners sat around, chatted with each other, chatted with the guards. If there was a conflict, the guards would do like a timeout kind of situation, get everyone to cool down, come back, resolve the problem. But what is the most interesting part about all of this is that the BBC unconsciously did a real Stanford Prison Experiment. They actually did what Zimbardo claimed he did. If his experiment were actually real, when the BBC recreated it, the same thing should have happened. Ironically, the BBC did a truer version of the Stanford Prison Experiment than the actual guy who made the Stanford Prison Experiment. I remember reading this when I was younger and being thoroughly depressed. Golding won a Nobel Prize in literature for his deeper understanding of human nature. And one of the shining examples of his in-depth understanding of human nature is the book Lord of the Flies. Now, the protagonists in this book are a bunch of choir boys, the goodest of good boys. These choir boys find themselves stranded on a remote island with no rescue in sight. So they realize they have to survive. They begin very cooperatively, creating a rule structure for themselves, chores, all of that, how to communicate. But as time goes by, things get darker and darker, and they're literally fighting each other for survival, and it gets gruesome, it gets violent, and it's very graphic depictions of horrible things that they end up doing to each other. They are finally rescued. This brings in a sort of reintroduction of civilization with the person who comes and finds them. They're shocked back into the civilized world, and that's when they realize how far they have fallen. This one really affected me. So I was so happy to find out that Bregman was ready to tear it apart. His answer to Golding's Lord of the Flies is once again based in the real world, where 6 boys actually were stranded on a remote island for 15 months. And Bregman tells us what happened. These boys were schoolboys. They were not choir boys, unfortunately, but they did go to a Catholic school, which I will say is close enough. One day, 6 of them, the youngest being 13, the oldest being 16, in the island of Tonga. These 6 boys decided to ditch school for the day, borrow a boat, and have a little ride in the ocean and come back. It was all good for a little while. And then all those boys, like idiots, fell asleep. They woke up and there was a full-blown storm. They were being tossed around, trying desperately to gain control. Then the rudder broke. So that was the end of that. There was no hope of steering. These boys were well and truly lost. And they drifted for 8 days. Somehow they survived and they found an island. Not the kind that you see on the desktop screensavers. The part of the island they saw was literally a vertical cliff face of like rock. This island, interestingly, was once inhabited, but not anymore. And the story about that one is quite a story. I wrote an article about it. I will link it in the description for you. They had a rough time of it because there was a lot of times when there wasn't drinking water, there wasn't enough food. They were really struggling, but that didn't stop them from working together to increase their chances of survival. They began every day with a little song and prayer, which is so sweet. They divided up chores for each other and stuck to that schedule. They were able to build like a little garden of sorts. They built a commune. They built even a badminton court, a makeshift gym, and all of these things just with like some handiwork and an old blade. One of the boys even fell off the cliff at one point and broke his leg. And the others went down to help him. They climbed down slowly, they brought him up, and they made like a makeshift splint to hold his leg in the right position. Got interrupted by the doorbell there. What was I saying? When they were rescued and they came home and a doctor looked at them, he was amazed because they were so healthy and so fit, and that one boy's leg that had broken had completely healed. a world famous book called Lord of the Flies, which seems to delve into the ugly darkness that resides within all of us. And he's given you a real life example of that exact same scenario and what actually happened, which thankfully is wonderful. It's a story of strength and resilience and friendship. This William Golding, who is so praised for his understanding of humanity, if you take a little look at him and his history, he was an alcoholic who was prone to depression. And as a teacher, he once separated his students into groups and told them to attack each other. This is the human being who the Nobel Committee is saying, yes, he understands the real nature of humanity. You'd rather take the word of a depressed alcoholic than what is actually happening out there in the world, because no one knows the stories of these boys, but everyone knows Lord of the Flies. Started with an experiment somewhere around the end of World War I, where somebody called Colonel Marshall was accompanying the troops, and he was able to observe how soldiers were behaving in war. And now I cannot tell you how many times I've heard dialogues in films talking about how war is all we know how to do, war is inevitable, that is when the hunter comes out in man, and that is when man is at his best, and we have this primal nature in us that drives us towards war and violence, and that is the most natural state of humanity. Colonel Marshall will tell you that is not the case. In World War II, 1943, he was watching the soldiers who were American soldiers who were backed into a corner at one specific time. Now, I don't know the exact details. It's given in the book, but I feel like I'll just give you the general sense of things. The American soldiers were backed into a corner, very critical moment. Still, soldiers were not firing. Colonel Marshall was wondering what is going on. So he started interviewing soldiers and found out that many of them had never fired a gun in the battlefield. And these same people would have done exceptionally well in training. And yet somehow, even when their life is on the line, they're not shooting. In fact, it got so bad that there was one general who was very frustrated with this behavior, and he says he had to go up and down the lines yelling, "God damn it, start shooting." Colonel Marshall's first question was, are these men cowards? No, they may not have fired their weapons, but they did not abandon their posts, even if that meant they were gonna die. So then, of course, he wrote a book about it called Men Against Fire. The average and normally healthy individual has such an inner, usually unrealized resistance toward killing a fellow man that he will not, of his own volition, take life. So much for the hunter, the violence inside all of us, and that we're just dying to kill each other and civilization is the only thing holding us back. This was a very contradictory opinion to what a lot of leaders were telling people and what, the general perception of human nature and war was. And a lot of other experts began exploring soldiers' behavior and trying to see whether there is really a pattern here. And they unearthed some very interesting things. They started interviewing veterans of the Second World War, and they found out, and I'm going to read out here, that more than half had never killed anybody, never killed a single person. That is huge. Most casualties were the work of a small minority of soldiers. The US Air Force, less than 1% of fighter pilots were responsible for almost 40% of planes brought down. So then they went even further back. 1863, Battle of Gettysburg. At the height of the American Civil War, they inspected 27,574 muskets recovered afterwards from the battlefield, and they found that 90% was still loaded. Then they found something even weirder. 12,000 muskets were double loaded, and half of those were more than triple loaded. They've overshot how much they actually even need to be loaded in the first place, going against all the training. Much later, these experts realized that loading a gun is the perfect excuse not to shoot it. All of these soldiers didn't want to kill anyone, but they didn't want to get penalized for not doing their job technically. So what did they do? They decided to act busy and get loading. So all of them were sitting there loading their guns, not a single one was firing them. In the French army in the 1860s, they found out that even if the soldiers did fire, they were aiming too high. So the majority of the battle was a bunch of men just shooting way above each other, while the rest are running around trying to find things to do so they look busy. It is incredible and also hilarious. It's so sad that we don't know any of this, and our popular understanding of humanity, even if you watch well-made films, we still don't seem to have a realistic picture of what war is actually like. And Bregman sums up Hollywood's attitude and accuracy towards violence, especially in this like battlefield scenario, by saying the image cooked up by Hollywood has about as much to do with real violence as pornography has with real sex. That 1% that's doing all this damage and killing all the people seem to be defining the 99% of other people who are just trying to stay alive and are not trying to kill anybody out there. Bregman kind of points out an interesting fact here, which is that historically have been many people in positions of power who belong to this 1%. Who themselves have more violent, more sadistic tendencies, and they perceive the rest of the world as mirrors of themselves. If they are like this, they don't trust anybody, they have these like very violent sides, they would kill someone else, they will assume that the rest of the world will behave exactly the same way, and they treat them like that. They make laws considering people like that. They are controlling the narrative here. We'll go back to what my father says. Totally warped. With that, we've come to the end of the first part of this brilliant book called Humankind. And in the next part, we're gonna look at what is going on. Why is it that Philip Zimbardo, William Golding are praised and claimed to be the experts on humanity? Why is it that only the negative seems to be getting all this attention and the positive doesn't? We're also going to look at what it's doing to us and what it's doing to the world. So stick around to see that video, but until then, hit like, leave me a comment, and make sure you subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.